Welcome back to the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum. It's part 2 of our tour of the Centurion Mark V. And we're going to start as usual up at the exterior of the turret, the TC's cupola. To the rear of it, you have the bustle rack, which wasn't on the original design of the vehicle, but it has since been added. Inside the bustle rack, mounted to the rear of the turret wall, and it predates the bustle rack, is the wire reel. Now, the wire reel was used in Larger, in bivouac areas, where you would have all the tanks would be set up in their defensive perimeter, but in order that they could communicate with each other without broadcasting and revealing their position, they would actually run telephone wire between the various tanks, and everybody would be on the same intercom circuit. Now, the commander's hatch door itself, the first thing to note is it is big. This is one of the largest hatches that I've encountered in a very long time doing this. You can imagine if you're covered with your cold weather gear and what have you, still, maybe your sidearm, you're still able to get in and out very easily. The door itself is very simple, spring-loaded single piece of kit. There are 3 positions. There is a full horizontal position, although the manual does say be careful doing this because it's so low you might hit other things around as you rotate the cupola. This is in the standard open position. There's also a full upward position, and then finally, of course, closed. As you turn to the front, he does have a blade sight right in front of him. You can see the gunner's primary sight has a protective guard around to the front. Just to the corners, you do see the antenna mounts for the 2 radio antennae. While I'm still on the outside of the cupola, I will paint note of the periscope here. It's every Centurion did come with them, but usually they were not mounted for one reason or another. It's actually kind of rare to see pictures with them installed. So that's it for the outside of the commander's hatch. Now let's go inside. This looks like from the outside a very large turret, and we'll see if it really is true. So I've come into the commander's seat, and there's a couple of very obvious points which are very immediately apparent. The first one is my long, lanky legs that people say, hey, you're treating tanks unfairly because you're too big to be in them. They don't even get close to where the gunner's seat is if you go, in a vertical line straight down. This is a roomy tank, and it's amazing what those extra few inches of turret ring have done for you. The seat does adjust in elevation. It's a fairly comfortable one. It's got a nice backrest. It is unfortunately stuck in the uppermost position right now. There is a fold-out foot platform for when you're standing up with your head out of the hatch. I now have it folded out of the way to allow my legs to drop down. The cupola itself will come in 2 types. The earlier type came with 9 periscopes. The later type came with 8. And it does have that binocular scope to the front. To traverse the cupola around, you had a couple of different options. One was this was a traversing hand wheel. Another option was you could pull down a release plunger and quite simply with the aid of this and another handle grab back here, use upper body strength and swing it around that way. The periscopes are of course all individually replaceable. You do note that they put padding around the outside just to protect you a little bit. Controls, he does have a power traverse control, and curiously, a manual elevation control. Now, it's very rare that you see a commander's position with a manual elevation, but sure enough, this is connected by way of, I think it's a band, down to the main gunner's elevation. So you actually can rotate this, and the handle for the gunner's elevation will rotate as well. It's physically locked in place. There doesn't seem to be a power elevation option. It is purely the manual. And there doesn't seem to be a manual traverse option. It's purely the power. So quite why, I'm not entirely sure, but there you go. He does have a couple other controls for the radio, which is actually located on the loader's side. And the stowage boxes for additional things, anything from hand grenades through fuses and light bulbs. There is a reasonably sized bustle to his rear, but unlike a lot of tanks which you put ammunition or radios, this is simply stowage. Anyway, so that's it for the commander's position. I'm now going to move forward into the gunner's hull. The one disadvantage of having the gunner seat so far forward compared to the commander's position is actually a little bit more difficult to get in and out. The gunner seat is adequate, I'll say. I mean, it's not the most legroom in the world, but I've certainly been in worse. What is perhaps a little bit more disconcerting is the position that your hands have to be for the duplex control system. The power traverse handle is far to the right and low down, whereas the power elevation handle is way up at shoulder height on the left-hand side. Quite why they did this, I'm not entirely sure. The manual controls are actually a little bit more easy to reach. Quite simply, the elevation is just above your left knee and the manual traverse is located just to the right of your right knee. So this is the gunner's primary sight. It's a by-8, and it is the only sight available to the gunner. So not only is it the primary sight, it's the gunner's only sight. Most tanks would have an auxiliary sight located next to the gun itself. It looks like there just isn't the room for it. It does have two optics within this sight. The first optic is a simple unity sight up here, and if you look inside, you'll see a little circle. That shows you what your field of vision is going to be when you actually put your head to the primary eyepiece. When you move down to the primary sight itself, you'll see that it is graduated for a ranging machine gun. Now, Mark IVs were not originally built with a ranging machine gun. It looks like this tank has had one added afterwards. There is no range scale inside the sight for the 20-pounder. It's just caliber 30 and the RMG. So you estimate your range with the RMG. You then input the range for the appropriate shot type into what is effectively a ballistic drive. This will adjust the elevation of the sight upwards or downwards depending on the range setting that you have put in. Once you've set your range, you then go back to your primary sight, place the crosshair directly on the target. No adjustment further for elevation is necessary. Pull the trigger. If you got your range estimation correct, as verified by the ranging machine gun, you should hit your target. For indirect fire, you do have the inclinometer on the left-hand side. This will give you your graduation for elevation, and the mil scale for traverse will give you your azimuth. Just in front of the ballistic drive is the quadrant for elevation. Use that in conjunction with the azimuth indicator for indirect fire. It does have some electrics to the right. It's got a stabilization system. Remember, the Centurion had the Metro Vickers stabilization system. Initially, it was in elevation only, but it became one of the first tanks to have stabilization, at least in theory, both in traverse and in elevation, which, according to the advertising literature, meant that you could hit targets on the move. And yes, on the test range, you could, as long as you weren't going too fast and the ground was relatively smooth. Still, it was, in terms of the technology, a great improvement over what had previously been the case when you had to come to a complete stop, fire from the short halt. At least in this case, you could still fire with reasonable accuracy at a low speed without stopping entirely. Not much else to be found in the gunner seat. Triggers are to be found on the power elevation, the manual elevation, and a foot trigger as well for the RMG, I have to assume. I'm going to actually change one of my earlier comments. The gunner seat here is not actually suited for a very long length of time. It's one of those things, yes, you have enough room, but you can't move. And after a while, you kind of get itchy. I've been sitting here now for about 20 minutes and I really want to move my legs a bit more. Fortunately, I can stretch back a little bit because there's a bit of room between me and the commander, but yeah, barely a passing grade. So I'm going to hop over now to the loader station and see things from his perspective. Well, getting into the loader's hatch is, as you can see, quite quick and easy. The hatch is very large, two doors which open forwards and backwards. I'm seated on his seat. There is no turret basket floor. The only thing which spins with the turret is the catcher bin for the spent shell casings. So the loader's got to make sure that if he's standing up, he rotates with the turret, or he just keeps his legs up off the turret floor when the turret is spinning. Alright, so this is the loader's safety switch. In order to avoid his legs or other limbs being chopped off by the gunner or commander power traversing the turret without noticing what the loader was doing, flips it to off. Power traverse has been disabled, at least in normal mode, and when he's ready to go, just quickly flip it back on and the gunner can now aim again. His job, of course, is to service the 20-pounder quick-firing cannon. He has about 65 rounds of ammunition scattered around, but only 4 are in the ready rack in the turret itself. Another 6 are located in a little bin directly underneath the main gun. The rest are scattered either underneath the floor of the hull or forward underneath the drinking water tank. They're going to fire a range of ammunition: APCBC, high explosive, smoke, canister, and fin. Now the fin round is Sabo and American, capable of punching through about 12 inches of steel, which by the standards of the time was actually pretty good. The problem was that even better tanks were being produced that was going to give the 20-pounder a little bit of trouble, which is why the 20-pounder was very quickly replaced in British service by the 105mm L7, which became basically the standard tank gun of NATO. Over its right shoulder, you do see the turret door. This is used for either loading the ammunition without having to lug it all the way up to the top of the tank, or simply ejecting the spent shell casings, which otherwise would have been sitting around in the bin, and frankly, you would end up filling up fairly quickly. I would estimate you get maybe 9 or 10 shell casings in here before you really have to start looking at emptying them out. But this is actually pretty typical. Usually the spent casings bin on any tank is only good for a first initial salvo, but most combat usually didn't fire more than several rounds at once before there was a sufficient pause that you could take care of this sort of thing. The operator is in charge of the radios as well. They are located on his side. Initially set off with the number 19 wireless set of World War II era, and then a number 88 was also added a little bit later. To the front of the loader, he does have one way of looking out, short of sticking his head at the top, and that is the periscope, which is adjustable in elevation and also rotates. You'll see if you look on the outside of these periscopes, you also have a visor to keep the sun glare off. To the right are the mounting points for the 2 machine guns. You got the caliber 50 ranging machine gun, it's the larger mounting on the left, and then to the right is the caliber 30, which basically it's a 7.62 effectively. And to the left you can also see the mounting points for the ammunition for the 2 machine guns. Remember, the ranging machine gun, it is not developed to be a killing weapon. You only fire 3-round bursts. They were exploding on impact, and that's why you don't need a very large capacity for the caliber 50. The 7.62, the 30 cal, yes, the ammunition, unfortunately, it has to be changed more frequently, and the box is further forward of the caliber 50. But given the respective size of the guns, that probably is unavoidable. So he's looked at the front of the loader. Let's say he's got a lot of room. Yes, the machine guns would come back, but you have some spent shell casings. But to his front, he's got the faucet for the water tank, the drinking water. He's also the man in charge of the boiling vessel and making the tea and the soup and all those other important things that the British tankies need. Further forward is going to be the hull ammunition stowage to the left of the driver. And the nice thing about not having the turret basket at this point is that you have so much room to access the stowage bins underneath. Well, it's a lot easier in this tank than a lot of others I've been in, such as the M26 Pershing. Last position in the tank, 4-man crew, driver. Now, I'm going to refer you back to my Comet video, where there was much mirth and amusement and merriment as I attempted to get myself into the hatch of this thing. And I'm happy to say that with Centurion, they seem to have done it right. The hatch doors are directly above the driver's position. And secondly, there's 2 of them, and they're spring-loaded, so it's pretty easy to open them up. Inside, you will also see that they have the periscope with the anti-sun glare visors as well. So let me open up the much nicer doors and get in. The gear lever is in the wrong place, but still, so much easier. Right, so here I am, nice and comfy. The doors do have to be opened in a specific sequence. You will note, however, that the advantage of having the split door is that they are low, which means that no matter which way the gun is turned, the chances are you got a very good chance of being able to open the door and get out if you have to. Now, the downside of these visors is that they won't open the doors all the way and lock into position. So unfortunately, driving head up like this, it looks like you have to prepare yourself a little bit ahead of time by removing the visors before you can do it. There is a way out through the crew compartment. If the turret is turned a little bit to the right, instead of accessing the ammunition compartment, you can now access the driver's compartment. Little canvas screen behind me gets out of the way and you'll be sorted. Also over your left shoulder, you can see one of the two fixed fire extinguisher bottles. They're CO2 bottles, high pressure. There are a number of flame detectors inside the engine compartment. So should the engine catch fire, or at least the engine compartment, because remember the fuel tanks are in there as well, an alarm will sound, a very loud alarm. Punch down the lever, this will break a seal inside the CO2 bottle. The nozzles, 5 of them, are in the engine compartment, and the CO2 should hopefully flood the fire that way. There is a second bottle and a second shot if necessary. For fires inside the crew compartment, it's handheld fire extinguishers. Setting off in the vehicle couldn't be simpler. The master power is located on the right hand side. Just set it to on, flip up the ignition, press down on the clutch, gear in neutral, start a button, and away you go. If it doesn't come to life because the engine is too cold, there is the lever here known as the strangle, which is English for choke, which does just as you would. Those of you who are young and do not know what a choke is on a car, go ask your dad. Setting off, you want to set off in second gear. First gear is really only good to about 2 miles an hour. The gear shift is a standard pattern. It's in the middle, and the 3 pedals on the ground: clutch, brake, accelerator, pretty much as you would expect. Now, an interesting problem with changing gear is that you want to stop the clutch from spinning, which is often done in the old days by double clutching. Now, in this tank, what you could do was a steering lever flick. And it was very simple. When you just flick the steering lever very quickly in neutral, it would stop the clutch and you could easily put into the next gear. Now, there are some catches with doing this. If you flick a little bit too much, all of a sudden you are going to careen off in an unknown direction. So the manual, although the manual says flick the steering lever, it also says this should only be attempted by experienced drivers and never attempted on the road, because there's such a good chance you will go off the road. However, other than that, the steering layout, the controls are simple. I'm a little bit unsure or uncomfortable with the gear lever in the middle, but I guess people will get used to it. My only concern is that the driver's hole is a little bit on the small side. I'm in the raised position, so I'm relatively comfortable right now. My knees are up high, it's pushed into me, so I would think that the gunner and the driver would have to be the 2 smaller people in this machine. This is a vehicle I can actually drive, unlike a lot of its contemporaries, shall we say, which either had difficulty with or flat out couldn't drive at all. Combine that with the easy access to the driver's position, the fact I fit in it, and all of a sudden this is a huge improvement over the tanks that went prior to it. So a passing grade there on this. There's not really much else to be said about the driver's position. It is fundamentally very simple, old-fashioned manual transmission and steering, just like every other tank, accelerator like every other tank. The one thing I would point out in reverse is that the steering lever always turns the nose of the tank to whatever direction is being pulled. So if you're driving forward, you want to make a left-hand turn, you pull the left steering lever. If you were driving in reverse and you want to make a right-hand turn, you still pull the left steering lever to turn the nose of the tank to the left and the rear of the tank to the right. So that's it for the driver's hole, and indeed that's it for the interior of the crew compartment of the Centurion Mark V. So I'm going to hop out, give a brief close, and I'll send you on your merry way. The largest operator was, of course, the United Kingdom, although curiously, the United States was the second largest purchaser, not for its own use, but simply to give to its allies in Western Europe under the Mutual Defence Assistance Programme. The hundreds of them were delivered to Denmark and the Netherlands. After it saw combat service in Korea and proved itself, the orders started coming in from the rest of the world. You saw orders from Israel, Sweden, Switzerland, and Canada. Australian Centurion saw combat in Vietnam, one of which was the famous atomic tank. This is the only tank known to have been exposed to a nuclear explosion and then sent off to combat anyway. The tank still exists, it's a monument somewhere in Australia. Comparisons with the T-55 over my shoulder are pretty much inevitable. Although the T-55 is a much smaller tank, the other characteristics are similar. It's an immediate post-war tank. It saw decades of service, many upgrades were applied to it. The question then becomes, which was the better tank? And without disrespecting the T-55, my nod does go to Centurion. The livability, the ability of the crew to be more efficient, to get more out of the tank, I think, and also greater room for upgrades would mean, I think, in my opinion, pound for pound, Centurion was the best tank ever made. On that controversial statement, I'll see you on the next time.